at what it means to worship God in spirit and truth, not only in spirit and truth, but what it means that we come to the Lord with clean hands and clean hearts, and that we pure hearts. I'm sorry, clean hands and pure hearts before the Lord. And so I'm excited about what God is doing. And so tonight, let's go ahead and get into the lesson. Get into the lesson on tonight, and as we talk about worship. Amen. Um, so this month we've been talking about more worship, and we've been talking about worshiping God. And my prayer again is that you've gained some more insight with what you already know about, and we've taken the time to reflect upon, our own personal worship and your own personal life as an offering to God. We talked about last week, what would it look like if you took everything throughout your day to the altar with you, right? You're going to worship your God. What would it look like if you took every single thing from your day, every text message to your coworkers, every conversation, every email that you sent, everything to the altar with you? What would it then look like, And so then there's this question of what is God looking for in our own personal worship? And then there's like, how must we present ourselves to God for worship? Do we just go to God any kind of way? Because we want our worship to be received by God. Amen. Then that's this question: what is the entire reason that we are to render our worship to God? These are some of the questions, that we have been answering over the course of this month's study. And today we live in a society that is filled with trouble. I don't know about you, but there's trouble. My troubles aren't necessarily your troubles. Your troubles aren't necessarily my troubles. And troubles may vary from person to person. Yet I know we sing the song, I'm so glad that trouble don't last always. I'm glad too. Yet the reality is that there is something about trouble, and sometimes it's trouble that lingers. Have you ever had trouble in your life that lingered, that linger a little bit too long? And before that trouble goes away, there's some more trouble added to that. And before that trouble goes away, there's some more trouble added to that. Have you ever experienced that in your life? But troubles are added, and then we find ourselves in a place where we can be consumed by our troubles, which often leads to worrying. Amen. Which often leads to worrying. And so, while I have, talked about worship being at the center of the believer's life, there's a question that asks, how can I worship when I'm facing trouble on every side? How can I worship when I'm facing trouble on every side? I mean, the doctor's report is not favorable, and I've been doing all I can to exercise and eat right. How can I worship when I'm facing the trouble when the people on my job are against me? And it seems like my entire world is crumbling down before me. How can I worship when I'm facing trouble on every side? That becomes a question. And so tonight, um, I want to tell you that I'm of the belief that sometimes the troubles we experience in our life are tests. And these tests are difficult, and God will see us through every test when we worship Him in spirit and in truth. In spirit and truth. Do you believe that? Do you believe that sometimes the troubles that we experience are tests? Do you believe that? And if you believe that, do you believe that God will see us through every test when we worship Him in spirit and truth? Tonight, I want to come to you from the topic, worship brought me back. Worship brought me back. This is a good one. Yeah. Tonight, I want to look at Abraham in Genesis 22nd chapter, first to the 14th verses here. And there's much more to this story, but I want to highlight this pericope of text so we can have a more full understanding about the story. You're familiar with this story. And so let's go here for a moment. Now hear the word of the Lord. I'm reading from the New King James Version. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. Then he said, take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took two of his young men with him and Isaac his son. And he split the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Then on the third day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. Then he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So the two of them went together. Verse 9. Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, here I am. And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord, it shall be provided. Our key verse tonight is Genesis 22:5. And Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. I want to tell your neighbor right here and say, worship brought me back. Yeah, worship brought me back. Got a question for you. Have you ever been in a place where you felt like you were about to lose your mind? Have you ever been in that place? Okay. DMX wrote the song that says, y'all gonna make me lose my mind up in here, up in here. I want to do the voice so bad, but I'm not gonna do it for y'all. He said, y'all gonna make me go all out up in here. You're gonna make me lose my cool up in here. Have you ever felt like that in your life? Everything is going crazy. Nothing is where it's supposed to be. Everything is out of control. You're in this place where you say, if one more thing happens, if just one more thing, I won't be able to take it. Surely one more thing did happen, or it does happen, or will happen. But some kind of way you maintain and don't lose your cool or don't lose yourself somehow. Abraham was in a place, y'all. Abraham was in a crisis. Abraham was in a crisis. If we look at just this story, this is crisis enough. But I want to rewind time a little bit right here. And I want to say that this is a real crisis in Abraham's life. Here's why. Remember, God has brought this man through like 4 definite crises, each of which was a real exercise of his soul. It was an exercise of his soul, of his faith in God, of his belief, his love for God, to worship God supremely. And I want to say that I believe it put a strain on his heart, a strain on his heart. As we journey with God, I want to tell you that there will be times in you that you will face crises in your life. And these crises may sometimes, unfortunately, strain your heart. And I want to say that there is a way through it all. There's a way to make it through all of this. Let's look at 4 things about Abraham's life up to this point. Why was he in crisis? Let's say, he was in crisis. First of all, let's go back here. He was called to leave all his relatives in Ur of the Chaldees when God told Abraham to go to a place far away, and I'll show you. We talk about this all the time. He was just to leave the whole group. Just leave your family you've been with all this time. You've been living among them, and you've been raising your flock, and you have all these things. You've accumulated your wealth, and God says, "Hey, move, leave from the whole group." Well, I got too much stuff. Not an excuse. You and all your stuff, leave. I gave it to you anyway. This was a real test for Abraham. And he didn't do it very well at the beginning because he took some folks with him that probably shouldn't have gone, but he loved them too. But he didn't do so well. Why didn't he do so well? The test came with Lot. Remember Lot, his nephew. Abraham loved Lot. He wouldn't have been carrying Lot around with him if he hadn't. But the time came when they had to separate, and Lot went down to Sodom. So there it is. Leave the land where you've been, leave your people, leave your family, leave the whole entire group. He takes Lot with him. Leave Lot too. Lot has to go somewhere. So, wow. You mean really do it like that, God? Yes, really do it like that. Then there was the test with this boy of his, the son of Hagar, Ishmael. Remember Ishmael? Don't forget about Ishmael. He's the other son. Abraham just cried out to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before thee." He loved that boy, and he hated to be separated from him. He thought that Ishmael was the son of the promise. He did. Although Sarah thought she helped God out a little bit with that, but that's another story. And so now here it is. Abraham comes to this supreme test, the 4th great crisis in his life. He is asked to give up Isaac. What do you mean, give him up? He's going to go work with you for the weekend? No. Abraham does not quite understand all the details for the very simple reason that God has told him. God gave him a promise. I need you to listen to this right here. He said, in Isaac, your seed shall be called. Abraham believed God would raise Isaac from the dead. And we're going to get to that later on in the text. But as far as Abraham is concerned or was concerned, he was willing to go through with the sacrifice. He had this idea that, hey, you know what? I don't want to do this, and this makes no sense, but I have too much evidence with God. So what we can see here is that Abraham is in crisis. I don't know about you, but when you look at in your life right now and you think about some of the things that you've gone through and some of the things that you've dealt with, some of the things that you may even be dealing with in this very moment, could you say that you've experienced crises in your life? Are you in a crisis right now? Yeah. And then, there's so many questions about this crisis. So let's kind of unpack the crisis here a little bit tonight in this lesson. I can't unpack every single thing, but I'm going to unpack some things I believe that are key for us to look at how it was worship that brought him back, right? So here it is. God led Abraham to a place of absolute surrender by taking the most precious thing in his life and leading him to surrender that thing as an offering, a sacrifice to God. I think about this for a moment, and I say that when we go to worship God, before we even go to worship God, I want to tell you that in our lives, we'll be faced where there is a place that we must come to absolute surrender. If you notice the first portion of Abraham's challenge that comes from Genesis 12, actually, where he goes away from his land, his homeland, Ur of the Chaldees, and he's told to go to a far place that's far away. He's going away, and in that same time, what he also does is he's told to go. He's not told to take anybody with him. He's told to go, but he loves Lot, his nephew. He takes Lot with him, and eventually they have to separate, right? And so there's going to be a place of certain and absolute surrender for every believer, that we have to give up even those things that are most precious, that we adore so much for God. Yeah. I want you to see here that Abraham had two sons. We talked about this. He had Ishmael and he has Isaac. I touched on this a little bit a while ago, but I want to bring this out a little bit more. Abraham and Sarah thought Ishmael was the son of the promise, after Sarah thought she helped God produce a child through her servant Hagar. If you remember the story, Abraham and Sarah believed they were too old to have a child. It's like, hey, man, I'm 86 years old. No way we're having a child. That's just not going to work. No, that's just not going to work on so many levels. But what happens is, so Sarah says, all right, so I'll allow you to go in and sleep with my servant Hagar, and that'll be the child of the promise. So she goes to do that, and the servant has a baby. It's Ishmael. Yay, he's the son of the promise. They go on for some time living, but then God's promise still remained with them. God reminded him that, hey, I've still got this promise for you. It's kind of like, so this baby that we help you with is not the promise? No. What I want to tell you is that when God promises you something, God doesn't need your help. God doesn't need your hand in the matter. God needs our faithfulness. That's what God needs. God needs our faithfulness for us to remain clear on who God is. That's what God needs from us. There is nothing that our little bitty hands can do involved in what God is doing. God is master of all. God has a plan, and many times we don't understand God's plans. But here it is. They thought that they could help God out, and God's promise still remained intact even after Ishmael was born, which clarified then that Ishmael was not the son of the promise. Yet God promised, watch this, to bless him as well. And this is truly another story for an entire another day, right? It's a whole nother story. If you know who Ishmael is, I think many of you do already. But Abraham has this promised son now that will be instrumental to God's plan. And now he wants Abraham to sacrifice him. Have you ever waited on something from God? Have you ever prepared yourself for something from God? You ever worked and built something for God just to be told to give it up for God's own glory, for God's own purpose? God says, you spent your time with this right here. You've had it. Yeah, it was yours. It's all good. I did it, but now it's time for you to give it up. Have you ever worked hard for something, achieved it for God to tell you to give it up for his purpose? If you have, our response is often, but God, you promised me and you said, and God fulfilled his promise. And God has a plan that is beyond our comprehension. Have you ever been in that place? Yeah. I want to tell you that in that very place that we are giving up this thing, or know that God is calling us to sacrifice something that he's given us for his purpose, in this moment, I want to say that we find ourselves in a crisis. Somebody ought to say that we're in a crisis. Yeah, we're in a crisis. So when you're facing a crisis, there's a question I often like to ask every believer. I often like to ask myself, who is God to you? Who is God to you? Is God a bully? Is God someone who just coming to mess with you? Is God someone who you cannot trust? Or is God still the lover of your soul? Is God still the way maker, the miracle worker, the promise keeper, your light in the darkness? Is that God? Is that who God still is to you? Yeah, because what we have to do as believers, we must decide who we're going to be when we're in a crisis. Yeah. in a crisis, even when things are going wrong, as we call them, which could be according to God's plan, but we call it going wrong. When things are going wrong, we must decide who God is to us. If this is a challenge, this is challenging to you to decide who God is to you, it is simply where you are in your faith. And I want to tell you that every time you find yourself in this kind of place, or you face with a crisis, and you want to doubt God, this is your opportunity, or the perfect opportunity, for you to trust God, because God is faithful. God is faithful. In the text, Abraham took the journey to the mountain. Abraham spoke in faith that he will be back. Yep, he spoke in faith that he will be back. Worship brought me back. Watch this. Genesis 22nd chapter, in the 5th verse, says it like this. And Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey, semicolon. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. The word of the Lord lets us know that he went yonder over to the mountain at Mount Moriah to worship. And it was the worship here that built his faith. He had faith in his worship, in his God. I don't know what's going to happen when I get over here, but every step of the way, I'm going over here because I trust my God. I have too much proof. God told me to leave my countrymen. God told me, God made me and my nephew, who I love, break up and go different places. God has told us that Ishmael, he blessed us with Ishmael, but then still kept his promise that Ishmael was not the son of the promise. Then still gave us Isaac when I was 100 years old. And here I am now above 100 years old. And so this God who I've been walking with, this is not the time to doubt God. I don't know where you've been in your life. I don't know all that you've experienced. I don't know all that you've had to go through. But what I want to tell you, that this is not the time to doubt God in your life. Yeah. Abraham had too much proof that God was with him and that there was no way that God would go back on his promise. I want you to remember something here. God had already promised Abraham that his offspring would become numerous as the stars in the sky and the sands of the seashore. Genesis 22nd chapter, in the 17th verse, says this: blessing, I will bless you, and multiplying, I will multiply your descendants as the stars. Multiplying, I will multiply. Wow. Your descendants as the stars of the heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. This is why Isaac is so important to the faith. If you ever wondered before, why is Isaac so important to the faith? Well, Isaac's birth is the manifestation of faith in God through adversity. Isaac is the promise. He is the manifestation of Abram's faith. Now, can you imagine worshiping God and sacrificing to God and burning all these lamb to God all these years and having a promise of God, and God has not given you the son of the promise, and you still sacrificing everything? I think in our humanity today, who we are in this Western world, we would have quit a long time ago. But here this man is 100 years old, 86 years old, 70 years old. Some of us are in our 70s now, perhaps, but some of us in our 40s, 50s, 30s, 20s, we would have quit a long time ago. Who are you going to be? And can you remain faithful to God, who has not produced that which God has promised he will produce in your life yet? Can you do that? So here it is. Isaac and Abraham, they're going up the mountain. Before we get this part right here, God did what he said he would do. Isaac's birth is the manifestation of God's faith through all the adversity that Abraham and Sarah had faced. So what part does worship play in all of this? I'm so glad you asked that question. Abraham's worship had faith at the forefront. Abraham's worship had faith at the forefront. Before he went up the mountain, he had faith. When Isaac had questions about the sacrifice that was being offered, Abraham kept his faith. Abraham did not fold on God and say, well, son, this is it. I've enjoyed you for these 13 years or so. You're going to die today. Instead, he trusted the person. He was told to give up the person that he loved the most. And he trusted God. And, we talked about him being 100 years. So he had waited all of his life and did not believe that he and Sarah could have a child. So what did Abraham believe? I'm glad you asked. Abraham knew that Isaac had a promise on his life already, that God was going to make people, that God was going to make so many families and nations from him. He already knew this. So whatever he was going to do with Isaac was not going to stop that, because it was a promise of God. God had already promised him and told him to trust him, and so he was being tested again. And so what he believed is that that if he sacrificed Isaac and actually killed him, that God was going to bring him back or something, some kind of way. I don't know what it's going to look like, but I'm going to do it anyway. I have a question for you. Even when God tells you to do something and you don't know what the outcome is going to be or how it's going to work for you, or your question where you say, well, make it make sense for me, cannot be answered, do you still trust God? God is not required to respond to make anything make sense to us as believers. We're required to trust God and to walk in faith. Here's what Abraham believed. Hebrews 11th chapter 17th through the 19th verse tells us, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promise offered up his only begotten son, true, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called. Okay, he knew this. 19, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. What he believed is that if I kill Isaac, that God will raise Isaac up. He had not seen this happen, but he knew that he had a promise on his life. Let me stop here for a moment and tell you that God is not interested in human sacrifice. That is not what this text is about. No one dies in this text. What God is interested in is a living sacrifice. Our lives, that we're living sacrifices, our bodies as living people, that we sacrifice our bodies to God, that we're holy and acceptable unto God, which is our reasonable service. I believe it was the worship to God that literally maintained Abraham's focus on what God had already said. Can you see me walking with one of my sons, oh my God, to a mountain somewhere to do something like this right here? I believe my focus would be, I don't want to do this to my son. I love my son. My mind will be focused on that thing. But I believe that the worship that Abraham gave to God, matter of fact, while I believe this right here also, I believe Isaac was involved in that worship with him. It was the worship that literally maintained his focus on what God had already said here. I believe it was the fact that he had experienced God so many times and knew that God was going to do something. I don't know what God is going to do, but I know God is going to do something. I don't know what God is going to do, but he then provided, here it is, a ram in the bush for the sacrifice. What did God provide for you when you were about to sacrifice something? Yeah. What did God provide for you when you didn't have nothing else? You said, Lord, here it is. This is what I've got. I'm giving it to you. I trust you with it, God. This is it. And I want to tell you that our posture when we worship God, let me go back to worship here. When we worship God, our posture truly matters. How we worship God. When we worship God, we cannot worship God with a spirit of doubt. We cannot worship God with a spirit of fear. We cannot worship God with the question mark of, I don't know. I'm here, but I don't know. When we worship God, we must know without a shadow of a doubt who God is and that we trust God and with all things. Psalm 104, 104 says this way, enter into his gates with thanksgiving and into his courts with praise. Be thankful to him and bless his name. This is worship, y'all. And we've got to come in with a thankful heart. When we worship God through our troubles, God will always bring us back. You won't be lost in the anguish or what society has to say. God will preserve you. God will keep you. And the question is, do you trust God with your most prized possession? What is it? What is it? God is giving you something, and God is saying, give it to me because your time with this is up. What is it? What is it? I believe it was worship that brought me back in my life, learning how to worship God through prayer that brought me back. Back where? Back to the place with God, to follow God as a son of God, to study the word of God, to submit myself, to surrender fully to God. I think my song had been, I surrender some, but then one day it became, I surrender all. No matter where you are right now in your life, I want to encourage you to keep worshiping God through it all. Worship will bring you back. Not only bring you back, worship will sustain you and keep you. Worship will keep you together in that seems to be tumultuous and where it seems that everything is going wrong. Worship will keep you. Tonight, I pray that this word has blessed you and given you something to think about as it pertains to worship, keeping you and bringing you back and sustaining you, and what it means to sacrifice that, which God has promised you. If you notice here in the text that God provides every time. God provides. God is a promise keeper. And guess what? What I love about this text overall tonight is that Abraham didn't get it all. He did not always get it right. He did not. Yet he kept worshiping, and he worshiped God supremely. He did not put anything else before God, worshiping God. He did not worship other idols. He worshiped God. And that's something that I want you to remember tonight, that when we worship God supremely and keep God first, that God will always keep his promises. Yeah. Lastly, God showed Abraham the ram when Abraham did what God said. Think about that. God showed Abraham the ram when Abraham did what God said. That was his provision. And so for us to experience the provision of God, we must do what God says. We can't do part of what God says and hope for a successful outcome. Amen. I pray this word has blessed you, has challenged you as we've talked about this month and more worship. I pray that you've gotten some things to grow on here in your faith as you journey with God. And so tonight, this may be your first, second, or third time here. And if it is, I want to invite you to connect with New Life Columbus, and because we're excited about having you here. And also tonight, you're good ground, and we recognize New Life Columbus as good ground. And so we invite you to partake in giving tonight as well. And also, someone may have a prayer request. And if that's you and you have a prayer request,